Today we are joined with Dr. Parker Kelley. He's out in UCSF as a postdoc, expertise in psychoimmunology, biomedical sciences, and psychedelics. The goal of this interview is a thoughtful discussion on psychedelics, science, and medicine, with an emphasis on caution and risks around these substances. We get pretty deep into the science today. If you're someone who's been listening in, maybe Joe Rogan or something, you see on TikTok shorts, or you're reading about these things and how they can really affect people, this is an episode to kind of clear the air and get a sense of what the science is really saying about these substances' ability to help people, the cautions, the risks, all these types of things. So I encourage everyone to stay curious, and wherever you are today, I hope you enjoy this episode of Learning with Lowell.
Learning with Lowell. Learning with Lowell is not recorded in front of a live studio audience, but we do take fan questions. Stay tuned and stay curious.
We were just talking off air, and we're talking about Parker's research, and he suggested that we start with understanding the metabolics of psychiatric illnesses. And I think that's very interesting, especially considering you're working somewhat interested in mitochondria, and mitochondria seems to just, it's a powerhouse of many interests, I would say, as the joke. So where's the relationship there? Why is that so important?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to begin, there was a great paper that came out by Martin Picard at Columbia recently called Mitochondrial Signal Transduction, in which he proudly proclaimed that the mitochondria is not just the powerhouse of the cell, but is the information processor of the cell. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And there's this kind of reframing of cellular biology going on, at least from that bioenergetic perspective, such that you kind of look at the nucleus more as a library rather than as the kind of brain or information processor. It turns out that the mitochondria not only produces energy, but it regulates the expression of nuclear and mitochondrial transcription factors that kind of mediate pretty much all cellular activity. And mitochondria, they produce, the majority of, energy and ATP that cells make, and energy is required for all biological activities. So it seems quite intuitive that, bioenergetic mediation of cellular biological activities should be, the forefront of studying really any disorder or disease, but it's not currently done that way. And so we know that psychiatric disorders and, just pathology broadly, is generally associated with this concept called allostatic load, where we, can look at a bunch of different systems in the body: cholesterol, inflammation, things like HbA1c, hypertension, glucose homeostasis, things like that. And people with chronic disease, including, myriad, maybe all of psychiatric disorders, tend to have a higher allostatic load. And they may actually be kind of drivers of psychopathology and aging-related disease and pathology generally. So people with hypertension or diabetes or cardiometabolic disorders are more, appear to be more likely to develop psychiatric disorders. And furthermore, stress kind of also drives things like chronic inflammation and hypertension and allostatic load associated conditions. So we have all this evidence that psychiatric disorders are associated with kind of cardiometabolic disorders, chronic inflammatory disorders, allostatic load. So allostatic load is really you can calculate it. It's a cumulative analysis of the load on the system from a bioenergetic perspective. So if you think about elevated HbA1c or inflammatory markers like CRP, hypertension, high cholesterol.
At any point in this conversation, if you find value in it, please subscribe. It is hugely beneficial, and it tells Google and everyone out there that this is content worth watching. Thank you for everyone thus far who has commented, liked, subscribed, and told their friends.
All of these can be kind of put into an analysis that produces a kind of metric of the cumulative allostatic load on an individual. So people with, cardiovascular disease or diabetes tend to have higher allostatic loads than the general population, higher levels of inflammation. And the same thing is true for PTSD and depression, anxiety disorders, and even schizophrenia. So all these disorders are associated with stress. Stress drives allostatic load. particularly like, if you get stressed out, your inflammatory biomarkers go up acutely, and chronic stress can lead to chronically elevated inflammatory biomarkers. And the conclusion here, the important part, is that this effect may be bidirectional. So we know that stress can precipitate psychiatric disorders. Stress also induces elevated inflammation and these other sorts of factors. And those sorts of factors may also predispose to psychiatric disorders. So if you have diabetes or a high allostatic load, any of those factors I mentioned before, in addition to others, you may have higher chances of developing psychiatric disorders. And all of these factors, including allostatic load, are mitochondrially mediated, or at least regulated in some sense. So there's this kind of cumulative evidence that metabolic factors and inflammatory factors, peripheral stress factors, have this kind of bidirectional relationship to psychopathology and psychiatric disease. That's what a lot of my work is focused on.
So, if that's correct, what do you think psychedelics are doing? So most research that's come out is saying, people say take psychedelics, MDMA, whatever, and it has some relationship to having a positive relationship to affecting the illnesses. So if it comes down to the metabolics of it all, what are these chemicals doing to people?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it has not been investigated very thoroughly yet. That ayahuasca paper that I published in ACS Chemical Neuroscience, we investigated something fairly novel, which is reactive oxygen species production in the brain before and after treatment. And we treated with either DMT or harmaline, two of the active constituents of ayahuasca. They were synthetic chemicals, which is why we call them pharmahuasca, or both of those drugs in combination. And what we saw was that DMT or the combination normalized reactive oxygen species production. So reactive oxygen species are produced as a byproduct of normal metabolism or by the immune system through a couple different pathways. And stress increases ROS production in the brain, as we previously showed in the model that we used. And other research has shown that PTSD may be associated with elevated oxidative stress and inflammation. So in our paper, we found that these metrics of cellular metabolism were normalized by our treatment. Basically, that was our initial finding, and other work by other labs has kind of replicated some of that stuff. Not our finding particularly, but there's a lab, the Vidaya lab, that showed that treatment with serotonin, which binds to the same receptor as serotonergic psychedelics, the 5-HT2A receptor, as well as some other compounds, including a psychedelic called DOI, radically improved mitochondrial functional capacity in neurons, both in dish, so in vitro and in vivo, which was pretty impressive. They improved mitochondrial functional efficiency and increased ATP production. So it does seem like there are these, 5-HT2A, which is the psychedelic receptor, mediated mitochondrial effects that kind of lean toward improving mitochondrial efficiency. And one of the important things that we see after stress, or especially chronic stress or traumatic stress in animal models, and even in peripheral measurements in humans, is that mitochondrial efficiency kind of goes down. So you can kind of think of mitochondrial efficiency as this, how much ATP or energy is produced relative to how much kind of deleterious or damaging byproducts are produced, like reactive oxygen species. So a kind of damaged mitochondria will produce more kind of damaging ROS relative to the amount of ATP that's produced. And it seems like mitochondria become less and less efficient because less energy is applied to repairing them during conditions of chronic stress, because chronic stress requires a lot of energy, and energy has to be kind of shunted in other directions in order to maintain cellular integrity during that chronic stress. So kind of, even though the literature is very early on, we have some evidence to suggest that psychedelics are actually directly interacting with mitochondria, or at least indirectly through kind of signal transduction pathways, to change the way that the brain produces energy and shifts it into a more efficient kind of energy production program. And this may also be true in the periphery. A lot of I used to one of my wonderful graduate mentors was Charles Nichols at LSU, and he has this incredible body of literature where he showed in a bunch of different inflammation models, particularly in the lungs, that psychedelics have these extremely potent anti-inflammatory effects. And a lot of the deleterious effects of inflammation are mediated by ROS, and mitochondria also regulate inflammation. So, in addition to Chuck's work and some work done by a group in Hungary, there is this kind of convergent evidence that psychedelics from different drug classes have this capacity to kind of, protect the cell from oxidative stress or reactive oxygen species production, normalize inflammation, and protect cells, and particularly neurons, from the effects of stress. So it seems like there's this kind of convergent literature that's really starting to suggest that maybe just like psychiatric disorders are associated with these kind of metabolic differences or shifts in the way the metabolism works towards less efficient energy metabolism, may be corrected by agonists at the 5-HT2A receptor, and perhaps other receptors that psychedelic drugs bind to as well. So that's currently the direction that I'm going.
Is it like a byproduct? It sounds like, is it an essential pathway of what psychedelics do, in the sense of, like, will you get to the point where you have to take psychedelics to have this effect, or will you isolate the part of the molecule that allows it to have this effect on the mitochondria? It's like the plan, so that you can focus it down and then reduce the likelihood that you'll have the negative side effects that are known to have happen when you're taking psychedelics. Like, is this pathway really, like, how big of I don't know how to phrase that question any differently, unfortunately. Like, how does that, like, shape up?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really, really insightful question, actually. I think what you're asking is that, are we trying to do medicinal chemistry on the molecule to determine, like, which epitopes mediate this kind of mitochondrial effect, and so we can isolate it and maybe produce non-psychedelic psychedelics? Or, is this essential to the effects of psychedelics, or is it a byproduct? Yes. Cool. So the honest truth is we do not know the answer to that question. We actually don't, and this is something that we may also talk about, but we don't really know the critical pathways involved in the effects of psychedelics. We know that this 5-HT2A receptor is probably really important. We know that from several different sources, particularly studies in humans where they block the 2A receptor with drugs like ketanserin, which is the 2A agonist, and it does seem to completely eliminate, or predominantly eliminate, the psychedelic effects in people. But we don't really know what happens downstream of that receptor, and there's even some evidence that other receptors may be crucial, or maybe highly involved in the therapeutic effects of psychedelics, which would imply that maybe, like you're saying, that these different types of effects could be teased out. But in regard to the mitochondria, that Vidaya paper was published in PNAS, I think in 2019. Did actually suggest that the mitochondrial effects are 2A mediated, because they also used a 2A blocker, I think 2 different ones, and showed that the mitochondrial effects were able to be blocked by just blocking 2A. So, just to get a little bit into the weeds here, when 2A is activated by either serotonin or, psychedelics, or even, non-psychedelic 2A agonists like glyceride, they activate a bunch of intracellular pathways. These are things like protein phospholipase C, which cleaves kind of lipids, and that actually goes to 2 different pathways, IP3 and DAG. And then there's also beta-arrestin and other pathways that like phospholipase A also get activated. So there's all these different pathways that get activated. And Dave Nichols, as well as some other investigators like Brian Roth, have tried to tease apart these kind of second messenger or signal transduction pathways to see how they differ from serotonin, because we know that serotonin isn't psychedelic, at least at reasonable doses. There's some evidence that you can give mass amounts of serotonin and it'll produce psychedelic type effects, at least in rodents. But those investigations haven't really yielded a particular psychedelic pathway. And so, we know that psychedelics induce certain types of neuroplasticity. We know that psychedelics induce this head twitch response, which is kind of the correlate that we use for psychedelic effects in mice, or wet dog shakes is the correlate we use in rats. And we know that they produce these, phenomenological effects in humans, but we don't really know, which effects are mediated by which pathways, and if they all can, be induced by 5-HT2A or not. So yeah, it's really not certain. But at the moment, we do know that other serotonin 5-HT2A agonists, like serotonin itself, also modulate mitochondrial activity, but we're not really sure the differences between psychedelics and serotonin itself. And the field's really very, very early, but we do think that this receptor seems to have this incredible possibility to modulate the mitochondria in ways that seem to go in the opposite direction of chronic stress.
It sounds really complicated. Well, there's two thoughts I have. Is like, how much money and how much time and how many different research projects do you have to do? Because the thing that I think a lot of people don't know about is when you're doing a research, whatever element of research, it'll seem pretty complicated, but you're really only studying one thing, because you have to control all these variables so that when you study that one thing, when you see a change or elevation, whatever it is, you actually can know that it was meaningful. And so if this is a very complex pathway, I imagine it's going to take a lot of different studies, a lot of different trials to really work it all out. And so I have like kind of a two for like, how much time and money would it take to really like work out these different pathways as they are right now?
Yeah, it's a very good and practical question. It would be very difficult to determine that at the outset, because sometimes experiments yield incredible results and we're able to figure out a lot pretty quickly. But other times, it takes years or decades to kind of whittle something down, or we spend half a century on it and we still aren't able to figure it out. But just in my estimation, there needs to be a lot more kind of in vitro and preclinical work to be able to, if we really want to be able to tease out these individual pathways. And try to determine which epitopes of the drug or which structural features of the molecules are mediating these particular effects. One thing I didn't mention is when drugs bind to receptors like 5-HT2A, which are called G protein coupled receptors. There's this idea called functional selectivity, where the receptor is always kind of changing and moving within the membrane, and then the drug, when it binds, selects a particular conformation, and that conformation is responsible for inducing a characteristic or particular set of intracellular pathways. So if that is true, then you would expect to be able to tease this apart in kind of more traditional ways, but it's not even certain that that kind of functionally selective differential activation of the receptor is really the difference between psychedelics and serotonin. So like I said, there's a lot of different trails that we may need to investigate in order to kind of get to the bottom of this. But there have been some like really phenomenal papers that have come out recently that suggest completely alternative mechanisms that were published in great journals like Cell and Science. So yeah, it will take some time, but to really tease out the mechanisms. But one thing that we are also working on in parallel is looking at kind of clinical populations and whether or not psychedelics just have this effect at all in humans. And of course, that will also take a little bit of mechanistic work, but it's totally different type of work than you would do in preclinical or in vitro work. So in that case, we may be able to determine that it's happening just by, a few clinical trials in, populations with mitochondrial dysfunction. And if we can, validate that this is actually happening in humans, that will go a long way toward developing therapeutics, because a lot of people don't know, but the FDA doesn't actually care that we know how drugs work. There's lots of drugs that we currently use that we either don't know how they work, or we know very little about how they work, or like SSRIs, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants. we thought we knew how they worked a bunch of different times, but people keep upsetting the apple cart and completely causing us to reevaluate our understanding of how they work. So as long as we could prove that these drugs are safe and effective, they can be utilized therapeutically once they go through the kind of FDA approval process. So yeah, just because it's a difficult problem doesn't mean these can't be effective therapeutics.
Yeah, it's interesting how often when it comes to science, I say we, but it's you guys doing the hard work. How often it seems that it's just like the Phineas Gage approach. Like there's a guy in neuroscience. He got like the rose spike through his head, and his personality changed. So it's like, oh, well, that's probably what the part of that brain modulates. And so it's like we might not know the underlying stuff, but from there you can do clinical trials. Like you're saying to directly see if this has an effect, like a mitochondria, like you were mentioning, which I think it's kind of interesting. I imagine like most people are like, no, they know it all the way down to the the atoms and stuff like that, which I think is kind of beautiful too. Like there's so much more to explore. There's so much more to see out there for scientists. For anyone listening, and they're like, oh, I'm really anyone right now. There's always that feeling, that fear, that when you see something that really strikes your feeling, and there's a lot of people who are getting really excited for psychedelics because of, like, for my excitement, it comes from the fact that, like, soldiers come back from war, they're having PTSD, they deserve the best treatment. And the thing is, like, there's some treatments that work, but for some of them, nothing seems to help them. And there's these things that seem to really do something significant here. And I love that. And that's why I get excited about it. But I think sometimes people feel like they get excited about something and then, like, they can't get into the wave to do something significant. But it seems like you're talking about something that might be decades of work, like a century of work ahead of us, with many different pathways to find your contribution to this field, which I think is awesome. Just as a little note there. But so you mentioned SSRIs a minute ago, and SSRIs in America, I think America is the #1 place in the world for SSRIs. Do psychedelics have similar downsides to SSRIs in terms of people? I know, like, for SSRIs, for instance, like sometimes they I believe, correct me, but I believe SSRIs over a certain period of time, the brain starts adapting to them. And so they stop working as effectively, and people can have really bad side effects. Are psychedelics, do they have the same type of risks as SSRIs?
Yeah, that's another really great question. And I wanted to say that I agree with you regarding the Phineas Gage approach. There are all kinds of different approaches in biology and medicine. And I would say most of our drugs were discovered, or just therapies in general, discovered coincidentally like that. And sometimes I think for the most part, we have a very kind of poor or just, working understanding of a lot of the therapies we use. We don't really understand well how a lot of these things work. And there's just immense horizons in front of us. There's so much more science to do. We're not even close. So yeah, to all the listeners out there, we need smart, brilliant, motivated people to help us out. Regarding your question about SSRIs, so SSRIs do have a specific set of particularly difficult side effects, and they do build tolerance, and they are not addictive formally, but they you can become pharmacologically dependent upon them, and they do have pretty severe withdrawals. If you've been on SSRIs for years, especially at the higher doses, and you were to stop them cold turkey, there can be quite severe for people. Psychedelics are not typically, none of the clinical trials that are currently being used for psychiatric conditions use them chronically. So it's usually 1, 2, or 3 doses, whereas SSRIs or most pharmaceutical antidepressants, you would be expected to take them every day. So, of course, your body will slowly adapt to any stimulus that is, chronically given. And that, actually may be responsible for some of the therapeutic effects. There are hypotheses that this adaptation that happens after a few weeks is actually responsible for reducing the antidepressant effects. But, when, chronically administered, they can cause, sexual dysfunction and there's a black box warning on a lot of SSRIs for increasing thoughts of suicide in teens and even in young people. So, there are all these side effects of the SSRIs, but they're typically associated with the chronic dosing rather than, psychedelics where they're, dosed acutely, like a single or just a few handful of doses. But that doesn't mean that psychedelics don't have adverse effects or the possibility of negative side effects. There are lots of potential things that can happen with psychedelics. Psychedelics may in like kind of instigate the onset of things like mania in people that are predisposed to bipolar disorder or other affective disorders. They can have kind of paradoxical effects where people become more depressed. They can cause headache, especially the day after dosing. They can also lead to the instigation of psychosis in people that are predisposed. Now, a lot of those things haven't been, studied to the extent in the same size populations as SSRIs. So we're not really sure how likely they are to, instigate manic or psychotic episodes, and whether or not that's even necessarily true, because most of the studies that have gone on so far in psychedelics haven't included populations that are predisposed to these disorders. So, we know that there are some things that seem to be contraindicated with psychedelics, and that there are these sets of side effects that can occur, but a lot more research will need to be done in order to, really determine for sure in large populations, who is likely to get these side effects, and, how common they really will be. And if people with predispositions really need to even worry about this, it may not be the case. It's really hard to tell from epidemiological studies whether or not that effect is causal or correlative. But nonetheless, we need to be very careful. We don't have a ton of information on these things, and more work needs to be done. But my intuition personally is that the side effects associated with SSRIs, those particular side effects, are unlikely to develop from psychedelics because the psychedelics are not dosed chronically, but there may be other side effects.
Yeah. So when I haven't looked at the numbers at this, and so this is a feeling, and I would love if you know the numbers, so this would be great. But when I think about the SSRIs in terms of if 10 people were taking SSRI, I would assume as a feeling, like the way it sounds like when I'm reading about it or I'm looking into it, but they never cite the numbers on these things. They would be 30% of them are going to have some type of side effect like that we've just mentioned. But when it comes to psychedelics, it feels like when I've talked to people, when I've had people come on, it seems like it's more like 1 in 10 or less. Is when it comes to actual, not error rate, but side effects that are really bad. What are the population differences of the two? Are SSRIs more likely to have side effects of the type that is severe that we're talking about? And how likely is it for psychedelics at the stage that we are right now for someone to have some of these psychosis related side effects, in terms of overall population from what we've seen? What's the chances of it?
So I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I think it's fairly reasonable, 30% of having some side effects. With SSRIs, I actually think it may be just for having any side effects like sexual dysfunction and things like that, maybe even higher, but don't quote me on the particular numbers. But severe side effects, I don't know if they're quite 30% in SSRIs. I think they're lower than that. And the problem is that with SSRIs, these side effects persist. Whereas with psychedelics, I think you're right that the rates of side effects so far in the studies are quite low, probably under 10% for severe side effects, certainly, because maybe much lower than that, because most of the studies on psychedelics haven't reported a ton of severe adverse events. I did read a study on ayahuasca recently where they meta-analyzed this stuff, and there were very few, if any, even in several different trials across many different trials, other than vomiting and emesis, which is already common with ayahuasca. But they didn't really paint a picture of there being a lot of long-term side effects, and that doesn't seem to be the case with psilocybin or LSD or these other psychedelics either. Although I want to emphasize that the populations that are being studied in clinical trials are very well selected at this point, because for the most part, we're only in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, other than I think MDMA has performed some phase 3 trials, and MAPS has performed some phase 3 trials with MDMA, and I think Compass is in phase 3 with psilocybin, which will include larger population. So we'll find out more then. But as the research currently stands, it seems like the side effects, at least the long-term severe side effects of psychedelics, are far less. Although, one important caveat is that people that have bad psychedelic experiences, they can be very bad and very scary, and can even be traumatic for people. And when I visited the Amazon and kind of did some of this work firsthand, kind of looking at how people are dosed with ayahuasca in these kind of traditional or semi-traditional healing centers in the jungle. I did witness some very severe experiences that were very difficult for people, and maybe even conferred trauma after that experience. But these experiences are exceedingly rare, and people that tend to have bad trips, especially in a therapeutic or ritual setting, tend to say things like, it was very difficult, hardest experience of my life, but they benefited from it in some way, which is, not what people say about the side effects they experience from SSRIs. So overall, I, want to emphasize that, these drugs can be dangerous, and they should be taken under, in a way that is responsible, and that you know what you're doing, or you're with somebody who knows what they're doing, or in a ceremonial or ritual context. I don't want to say exclusively that people should not take them on their own, because there are plenty of people that benefit that way, and they are legal, or at least decriminalized in a lot of major cities, but they should be taken with caution and understanding. And it's especially high dose of these things should not be taken kind of willy-nilly, or without a lot of respect. So
yeah, I was wondering, I wonder what SSRIs, when they were in this stage, as psychedelics are in terms of understanding them, what their side effects, all these different things that we're seeing now in them, were like. A lot of times with FDA or what have you, sometimes it is like they kind of catch those problems afterwards, when they're in the populations, and you really can see and tailor accordingly. So I wonder if they were in a similar situation, like really being cautious and being safe is heavily warranted, if they were weighted similarly, 1 in 10 in the population, so that they were studying at the time. I wonder what, if anyone's ever done that parallel, it would be, be really kind of an interesting, just a little look. It doesn't mean that they're correlated, like they're going to have the same effects, but I just think that's kind of interesting. Similar base structure of side effects, and then seeing where they can come from there, to kind of tamper down expectations, because psychedelics kind of seem almost like this miracle thing in terms of this capacity to do some good work for people. And SSRIs have been overused, it seems like, in the US, like the number one place in the world to ever use it. It seems like it's overprescribed, especially with the long-term and sometimes permanent side effects that you were talking about. I don't know, anyone who's ever done that work, please send it to me, and if you're interested as well, I'll tag you in it, because that seems very interesting. What is, just as a quick question, what is emesis? I do not know this word.
emesis is vomiting, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So ayahuasca in particular, most psychedelics are not associated with GI distress or vomiting. Sometimes they are during an acute intense experience, but ayahuasca is for sure associated with that. It's quite common with that drug. So it's not really considered an adverse event for ayahuasca studies.
Yeah, and another clarification question. So for psychosis, for any of the side effects of psychedelics, it goes away, like you go back to normal after a period of time. I thought I was reading once that there are people who, like, they can have a psychosis or something like that, and it doesn't return to normal. Like they just kind of it gets worse and it stays that way.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was suggesting. For the most part, it seems that people that is what happens if people have a discrete or acute kind of episode. It tends to be that with psychedelics, people tend to go back to normal. But in people that are predisposed, like they have a relative with schizophrenia, and they're kind of in that window where psychosis or schizophrenia usually develops, which is late teens, early 20s for men. It can be a little bit later for women, but it does seem to correlate with people developing schizophrenia. Their first, episode or first use of a psychedelic drug. THC seems to also be correlated with this, So yeah, same thing seems to be true for bipolar disorder, but these are all large correlational studies, and it could very well be that it's just when that people are going to have those episodes if they're predisposed either way. So it may not be causal, it may just be correlated. It also seems that highly stressful events seem to precipitate people's first manic or psychotic episode if they're predisposed. So it could be that the stress of the drug experience is related. But again, it's not known at this moment whether or not they really would cause something like that, or if they would just accelerate it or trigger it in somebody who's predisposed. So a lot more work's going to need to be done there. We don't know for sure that that's the case. There could be a world in 20 years where we're not afraid to give people that have a first degree schizophrenic relative psychedelics, but we just don't know yet.
Yeah. And then when you're visiting the Amazon, I'm familiar with ethnobotany, and that's not what it doesn't sound like that's what you're doing. What is the term? And then what was it like to be in the Amazon looking at people like these shaman, I assume it's shaman type people doing this type of work. So is there a term for doing that? It's not ethnobotany. Ethnobotany is like you talk to indigenous Americans or indigenous people to learn what, plants they use for the pharmaceutical needs. But you're going down there for research purposes, it sounds like. So then, like, what's that term, just for fun? And then what was it like actually going down there and doing it?
Yeah, so I went down there twice, and I also visited an Ibogaine center. And the first time I just went for, kind of research purposes, but I, went for my own interest, and I worked at the center because I was just an undergrad and couldn't afford to really pay for a retreat. So I kind of did this kind of work exchange program. And so, there's no particular title. I was just, finishing my psychology degree and had just finished my philosophy degree, and I actually had a friend from elementary school who developed addiction to opioids, and he had been to Western rehab several different times and couldn't really get treated, but he went to do ayahuasca at the center as kind of a last ditch effort to get clean. And he was the difference was incredible. He did end up relapsing, and it takes time for people to work through a lot of the stuff that's contributing to addictions. But the difference between that and the kind of 3 or 4 Western rehabs that he went to was just tremendous. He was clean for many, many months, and his whole demeanor and personality were a lot healthier. And so after seeing this, finishing up my psych degree and knowing that there's no really therapeutics that have such effects, I became really interested in it and signed up to work at this place. And yeah, it was really interesting. I went to Iquitos, Peru, originally to the Hummingbird Retreat Center and later to the Temple of the Way of Light in 2019, which is the most recent time I went, which was also for similar reasons, but a little more research oriented. But yeah, I mean, at the first place I went, I worked with some healers, or they call them curanderos or ayahuasqueros, from the Shipibo tribe, and which is kind of indigenous to the region around in the Upper Amazon, Pucallpa and Iquitos, that area, and then also some kind of syncretic religious traditions where people had kind of integrated Catholicism and a bunch of other kind of traditional practices used in the Amazon from diverse different tribal groups into the way that they practiced with ayahuasca. So yeah, I worked with 2 different healers, or shamans, or whatever the language people prefer is. At that center, and it was really interesting to see the different ways that they worked with the medicine and interacted with the participants and stuff like that. It was honestly really fascinating. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And then at the second time I went, 4 years ago, I worked exclusively with the Shipibo tribe, and it was like since it was a Shipibo center, and it's like one of the larger, more prestigious ayahuasca centers in Iquitos, it was quite a different experience. It was really fascinating. I mean, one of the interesting things is that they sing these songs called Icaros, which they actually attribute a lot of the healing or medicinal effects of the experience to those songs in particular, and they make these beautiful kind of like blankets or tapestries, and in a lot of cases they kind of symbolize their particular songs on visually in those tapestries and stuff like that. So it's really interesting. The way that they approach ayahuasca is not particularly a drug effect or a therapeutic effect of the plants. But instead, it's this whole kind of ceremonial and like retreat kind of experience. And of course, these centers are not exactly how ayahuasca was traditionally used in the Shipibo tribe or any tribe. I mean, there are at least 100 different ayahuasca using groups in the Upper Amazon. And they all have at least 50 different names for ayahuasca. So now over the past 40 or 50 years, it's kind of transformed, from something that they use or the healers use particularly, or people in the tribes use, or the healers use on them when they're sick, or even to like for spiritual reasons or for hunting or to settle interpersonal disputes. It's kind of transformed into this thing that's kind of this outward facing programs for Westerners or other people from the area to come in and get healing or kind of interact with them in ways that are psychotherapeutic or whatever. But the frame that they use is that this drug or these plants, they have this like spiritual connection to the plants, where they speak to them and interact with them in these really beautiful ways. They think that these plants help people open up to the healing, which for them is interpersonal and community oriented in a lot of ways, rather than kind of just individually oriented, like a lot of the kind of psychedelic clinical trials that are currently ongoing that really do focus on the drug effects, but psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, so interactions between therapy and the drugs. But studies in the US are typically not community oriented, and you don't have somebody singing to you throughout the experience and having this very personalized kind of spiritual or directed kind of experience. So yeah, it's a very different tradition, and a lot of those traditions are probably for good reasons not being kind of brought into psychedelic clinical trials here, but it was very profound to see the way that it's practiced there. And I drank with them, and as it was part of my retreat, and that, I mean, of course, ayahuasca itself was a profound experience for me, and definitely top 5 most important experiences of my life for sure. But yeah, I want to really the purpose I want to emphasize that there's a bunch of different ways to use psychedelics and ayahuasca, and it was really cool to be able to see them used in the traditional context and understand the way that they think about causation and in terms of producing healing, rather than the just kind of very discrete or mechanistic way that we understand it as a pharmacological effect, or as this interaction between pharmacology and like a psychotherapy.
If they're correct, I would think, if they're correct in their thinking that it's the community, the whole effect of the songs, the place, everything coming together, that gets the result, that the desired result, I would think then that the very emaciated, very focused clinical trials that are happening in America would have less of effect, if they were correct, like just as a thought. So then does that prove out in the science when we're doing these clinical trials? Do the ones in America not have the same power in terms of like the effects as that people generally see when they're doing these not retreats, but doing them with these type of community minded places?
So that's a very difficult question to ask, because we don't really have apples to apples comparisons. There haven't been a ton of real placebo-controlled clinical trial, or I don't want to say real. There's plenty of benefit to studying these retreat centers, and there's been amazing work done at these retreat centers, or even in ayahuasca churches like the Santo Daime or Unidad de Vegetal. Hopefully, I pronounced those correctly. Probably not, but there's huge benefit, but it's really hard to compare, or very difficult to compare, studies that were done at a retreat center and the effect sizes that they see on psychotherapeutic outcomes, or on psychopathology, or even other peripheral disorders, and like what we see in clinical trials, because the populations are very different. The populations for people going to retreat centers are self-selected for people that are willing to go, fly across the world and go through this kind of, there's aspects of the retreat that are difficult other than just ayahuasca. These people are highly motivated. Whereas people in clinical trials may also be highly motivated, but it's a totally different circumstance. And so, I mean, a lot of the studies that have been performed in kind of more traditional or at retreat centers or with these churches have shown really profound effect sizes. But the effect sizes here in psilocybin trials and stuff have also been fairly large for the most part. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a important mechanistic effect of their kind of pomp and circumstance and the kind of Icaros, the singing, the community interactions and stuff like that. I just think that there are probably independent effects and interacting effects of all of these different modalities. I do think that there are just physiological and molecular effects of psychedelics, and I think that a lot of the effects may be experience dependent, such that they may be right that if you can kind of induce metaplasticity or induce certain forms of opening up of the brain to be able to adapt or change in relation to one's pathology or psychiatric disorder or whatever someone's working on, that may be mediated by the drugs, but the therapy afterwards that we do, the integration work and the personal work that individuals do, that may be crucial for directing that plasticity in a way that is actually therapeutic. And some people or people with certain conditions may respond really well to individual one-on-one psychotherapy, depending on what the cause is and the mechanisms kind of underpinning their, circumstances are. Whereas other people may be, more, apt to benefit from kind of community and ritual and ceremony and Icaros and the whole kind of ayahuasca kind of cultural milieu, or some people maybe prefer working with the ayahuasca churches. And I do think that psychiatric disorders and their causes are there may be kind of molecular things or neurotransmitter things or plasticity related things that we can kind of see between them, but one person's depression may have different causes than another person's depression. And if their depression is driven by inflammation, anti-inflammatory may be an effective therapeutic, but a lot of people, their depression is driven by sociocultural factors or socioeconomic factors or personal life stresses or childhood developmental stressors and things like that. So I think that what we're really doing is we're learning about this new toolkit that we have of kind of pharmacologically or botanically enhanced either psychotherapy or just at least some kind of actual interactive kind of therapy or community-based therapy. So I think that we have this new pharmacological or botanical toolkit, and we also are just kind of beginning to understand the importance of kind of the experiential component in kind of directing where that plasticity and adaptation kind of grows. So I think you may be right. No analyses directly like that have been performed as far as I know, and mostly because it would be really hard to meta-analyze studies that are so different. But yeah, I think that might kind of be right, but there also may be reasons why the therapeutic effects experienced by people in clinical trials or in different modalities they're just as valid and important. I just think they're different.
Yeah. From the traditional side, is there anything there that when psychedelics have been proven out, the research has been done, that you would that you'd want to test out to see if it's something that can be integrated into the clinical side of psychedelics? Is there like something about the process, the procedure of how we currently are doing it now in a clinical, the US way, let's call it like the West way of doing it, versus traditional? Is there anything there in the process that you think like there might be something there that you'd want to research to then potentially integrate into the procedure process of using psychedelics?
Yes, absolutely. So currently in designing this study that we're to translate my preclinical pharmahuasca study into human clinical trial, we're wondering which music that we should use, and that musical element I think is probably quite important. It's unclear exactly mechanistically why and how it's important, but we know that music impacts our mood and our affect, and affect and mood are potentially driven largely by metabolic factors, or at least areas of the brain that monitor, our energy utilization and demands and production. And a lot of these regions are impacted by psychedelics, and they're also impacted by our by what's going on in the environment, our set, what we bring into the picture, and the setting, that including the music and the environment that we're in. So there could very well be an important interaction there, to where the type of music or the type of kind of environment or set really makes a big difference for people. And there's a cool paper published by Fred Barrett and some other, I believe Fred was on that paper, but some people at some researchers at Johns Hopkins, where they actually used two different kinds of music. Actually, I think it was Matt Johnson's study, to be honest, but in a smoking cessation trial of psilocybin, and they did, seem to see some. It was a small study, so it wasn't really powered to show really robust, statistically significant differences. But there may be differences between the types of music that people use and how effective the therapy is. So yeah, that's one thing. Music, particularly how it impacts affect and how our affective state, may be one of those important contexts that kind of steers that plasticity in directions that are therapeutic. If somebody's having a very positive mood and the brain's very plastic, perhaps that can help facilitate them working through some psychological content or something like that is important for their recovery or healing or whatever the case may be. And the other thing is the community aspect of it, and group therapy. So my PI, Josh Woolley, actually did an amazing study with psilocybin on people with, HIV or chronic HIV diagnoses. And they were able to they had to take the psychedelic with a one-on-one with a therapist, or I think it was them and a dyad, a male-female therapist team, I believe at the time. But then everything else, all the integration was group therapy integration. And I think that's it. It's just a small study to begin. But I think that's another angle that may be really important, especially for people, working through interpersonal situations, or people, for whom, connection and group work would be really important. So yeah, I think those are really two important things I'd be interested in.
Yeah, the music one in particular makes a lot of sense to me. I was reading somewhere that some of the first songs are really based on the human heart. And I've had people on who have talked about this at length, but the heart and the brain, whatever happens to the heart happens to the brain. And so this idea that we could be playing something that's, based on a heartbeat, like all music kind of just affects the heart, which then affects the brain, and then you have these psychiatric disorders. I think that feels like there probably is something like you could probably like isolate it down in an experiment and probably see something there that does feel. I agree that'd be really interesting to see if music's a part of it, and like to what extent and why. That'd be a really funny, like not funny, but a really fun thing to go down. So it seems that like each psychedelic has its own speciality in terms of like what it can do for the brain. What made you, and it may have just been like your PhD and like whatever, how things worked out, but what made you choose ayahuasca to like really focus down on versus like psilocybin or some of these other things? Like what not just about it, but like what about its effect on people that really got you interested in it in this way, that you like spend years working on it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's probably going to end up being the case. At the moment, we don't have a ton of like specific evidence differentiating the different psychedelics in terms of their therapeutic potential. There's some preclinical evidence that suggests that different chemotypes or different classes have different effects, or different individual drugs. But yeah, my intuition is that we will probably, eventually, kind of understand this toolkit more and know, what drugs are more effective for which conditions. Particularly with DMT, I mean, there are really two reasons. There was a investigator, Dr. Steve Barker, who was one of my kind of core mentors when I started graduate school, who had been doing research on endogenous DMT since the 80s. He had worked at UAB with Humphrey Osmond, one of the kind of big original kind of psychedelic researchers. He was a kind of British MD, who actually was the first person to give mescaline to Aldous Huxley. And since Dr. Barker spent most of his time working on endogenous DMT and also the metabolism of ayahuasca, that was one main reason his influence. Also, DMT is particularly interesting because it is an endogenous compound. Whether or not it produces kind of near-death experiences and things like that is more speculative. Yeah, one of the things that really interested me about DMT was that it is endogenous, so it's produced in the body in mammals. We've seen that in rats and mice, and it has been measured peripherally in humans, although it's very difficult to do so, and there's some skepticism about that. But yeah, because it's very similar structurally to endogenous neurotransmitters, it's produced and it's also metabolized much like an endogenous neurotransmitter. So it's got a very short half-life and a very quick onset. And so because of this, it's a very kind of clean experience. Like the experience happens fast and it wears off very quickly, which could have important therapeutic potential. And the fact that it's just it's in so many plant species, hundreds if not thousands around the world, and there are lots of different ways to make ayahuasca from a lot of these different plants, or ayahuasca-like kind of combinations that are psychoactive. And then the Peruvian traditions and Brazilian traditions all over the upper Amazon. People have been using this for probably hundreds of years, if not longer. And then, of course, the experience with my friend, kind of seeing him improve so much. So yeah, DMT and ayahuasca really was a convergence of a lot of my individual interest. I was also interested in ethnobotany, and I wanted to do that kind of scientific expedition to the jungle. And yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. Some of them mechanistic, some of them just the circumstances. And yeah, I forgot to mention one of the last reasons is that I was interested in metabolism and oxidative stress and inflammation. And DMT also binds to a receptor called sigma-1, which may be cellular protective and have its own benefits in addition to the serotonin receptor. So that was another reason, looking at oxidative stress and inflammation, that I was particularly interested in DMT.
Of the psychedelics, are there ones that have particularly low risk as it comes to side effects, or however you want to categorize risk, and some that have more higher risk?
For the classic psychedelics like LSD, mescaline, DMT, psilocybin, I don't think we really know whether or not some are more risky than others. I think psilocybin's been consumed the most by the largest number of people, and it's been the most studied. So if you were to bet on one, you'd probably bet on that one, but I don't think that we have real strong empirical data that that's the case. They all seem to be extremely safe for the most part. Whereas the other kind of, more experimental psychedelics, or ones that haven't been studied as much, those, may be riskier, particularly MDMA and ibogaine, and particularly ibogaine may be, particularly risky. We know that there's a, fairly high, I wouldn't say fairly high, but there is a significant chance of cardiovascular events with ibogaine. MDMA is also, it's a stimulant. It increases, catecholamines, and because it's a stimulant and not just a serotonin 2A or serotonin receptor agonist, it does, it can also produce, higher rates of side effects. So, but for the classical psychedelics, I am not aware of any evidence suggesting that any of them are safer than others.
If you were to, I guess this would be unfair to ask a scientist, but I would ask you, like, if you were to guess which one's the safest, I imagine you'd probably go with ayahuasca or something, because then you're putting so much time into it. But it's unfair to ask a scientist to guess this, so I will not ask it of you. What are some books? Scientists won't do it. Go and ask a scientist to make a guess. They won't do it. They like to qualify things. What are some books you recommend people check out, either in this space or in general? It'd be really cool if it was in this space. I'm always trying to learn more and read more. I read The Immortality Key that talks about like the ancient, psychedelics, which is pretty cool. But what are some books that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good one. I would definitely recommend The Immortality Key by Brian Muraresku. Yeah, he's fantastic. It's fascinating. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a book that he references there a lot called The Road to Eleusis. that book's pretty cool, just for more background reading in that topic. With regards to other psychedelics, or let's see. I mean, just obviously in pop culture, How to Change Your Mind is really big. Michael Pollan's book, which I thought was good, but kind of like fairly basic. In regards to psychedelic integration and like working with these medicines, there's a book called Psychedelic Integration that's really good. I would definitely recommend that. Particularly for DMT, there's DMT, the spirit molecule, which was a write-up from Rick Strassman of the kind of first study on psychedelics that was done since Prohibition started. That was done in the early 90s. That's pretty cool, just in terms of, he's got all these awesome kind of trip reports in there of what happened when he gave people injections of DMT, and those are fascinating, although it's kind of an older book. Let's see. I think that pretty good suggestions. I mean, of course, like there's the classic ones, Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and Alan Watts also wrote one called The Joyous Cosmology from the same time period, where he describes these kind of early experiences. I think those are really cool because there was no kind of psychedelic zeitgeist at that time. Like these were kind of philosophers or literary people that were just writing about their experiences. So it's cool to see those without the filter of all the scientific culture. I think those are definitely great places to start.
Will you write a book on ayahuasca in general?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, at the moment, all my time is taken up writing papers and trying to get a faculty job. But yeah, that's definitely something I've thought about.
Yeah. Well, if you do, or if you need a beta reader, I will read it and I'll give you my feedback. I have heard of Alan Watts a few times. Is he worth reading? Like, what is he about? I hear him a lot. I hear his name a lot, but I haven't looked into him.
Yeah, Alan Watts is great. I would say he was not really an academic philosopher. He was originally an Anglican priest who was interested in kind of Eastern religion, and he spent some time working at a Zen monastery. And but really his shtick is comparative religion. And as an Anglican priest, he was very good at translating a lot of these ideas from Buddhism and Hinduism into the language of Western religion and Western science. I mean, he was a brilliant man and an incredibly clear thinker, I think, for his time, especially considering the material he was working on. So if you're interested in Eastern religion or comparative religion or meditation and things like that, I would say he's like the best place to start, because he's really good at taking these big ideas and putting them into a framework that's easy for at least Westerners to understand. So he was, I studied, some Eastern religion and philosophy and stuff like that, and he was always a great resource. So I think he's great. He wasn't really a psychonaut particularly, although he did take psychedelics several times in the I think late 50s and early 60s. As part of different studies and things like that. And he was extremely good at articulating the similarity of the psychedelic state to mystical experience. And as some of the listeners might know, the Hopkins group, especially Bill Richards, and Griffiths have done a lot of work in showing that the psychedelic experience is very similar to mystical experiences that are produced kind of on the natch or without drugs. And also Tim Leary did some of this work back in the day. With in comparing these sorts of things. So yeah, I think Watts is I would highly recommend him if you're interested in that stuff, but he's not really a drug researcher type guy, but he's I think books, what's it called? The book on the taboo against knowing who you are, I think is a pretty good one. Just to summarize all his work, and also The Wisdom of Insecurity was really helpful for me.
Yeah. And then I know you studied philosophy, so this kind of is like good transition. I was reading this book on the meditations, and it was like a translation they had in the beginning, which I really enjoyed. It started by explaining how philosophy meant something different back then. Philosophy back then was more like how self-help books are now. It's more like understanding the world and how you fit into it, and in that way, versus where like a up until, I don't know, like the 1900s or whatever, philosophy is more like this, like how do things work, how does the mind work, dualism, stuff like that, which is different. It went from being like kind of like self-help, like how do you deal with trauma and all these other things, to like something more like that. So you studied philosophy. I haven't really read anything about Heidegger, for instance, but what is modern philosophy about? Like what problems are they tend to chewing on? Are philosophers now chewing on?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, it's interesting that you point out that transition that's occurred. So there's really two schools. Well, there's more, but essentially there's two schools of philosophical thought that kind of generally persist today. There's continental philosophy, like you mentioned, Heidegger. These are also include people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard, and people, the existentialist and phenomenologist from Europe. And then there's empirical philosophy, basically analytical philosophy, which focuses more on the problems that you're talking about. So most people, philosophers of mind, logicians, people that are trying to solve particular discrete problems using abstract logic and things like that. These are mostly analytical philosophers. So there's still now a lot of people like some of my mentors at LSU, John Cogburn, are trying to kind of synthesize these two traditions. And yeah, I think that's really cool and fantastic. But yeah, I think a lot of the kind of analytical philosophers are focusing on problems of language and philosophy of mind, and looking at things kind of like a scientist would look at them, but from a philosophical orientation. I think Alan Watts said that analytical philosophers would wear a white lab coat if they could. And I don't mean that as a criticism. Analytical philosophy is super cool. And, but yeah, they're more, rigorous in certain ways, whereas continental philosophers, they come from different tradition and emphasize things like phenomenology and more of these existential questions that you were talking about before, but in different ways than the ancients or the moderns did, like Descartes. So yeah, there's really these two kind of traditions, and I think the coolest work is people that are kind of synthesizing. There's also postmodernism. I didn't want to go into too much detail, but things have kind of changed besides those two distinctions, but that's kind of a brief summary.
Well, yeah, I feel like we're in a time period where like everything has boring labels, like postmodernism or postmodernism. So I just feel like it should be modern, and then we should have like new categories, but I don't name these things. But if you were if you had to just study philosophy, is there like a vein or a thought that you would chew on, that you would think about, that you'd work through?
Yeah, I mean, I was particularly interested in philosophy of mind, and but the reason I was interested in problem of consciousness, and particularly I was interested in but the self, and representation and identity, and that one of these things that spans really continental and analytic philosophy. But I found that I just really didn't have the ability to dig into the literature of how the brain functions, and what things do we know about the brain regions and networks that mediate these effects, to really fully utilize my philosophical education. So that's why I went into psychology, and then medicine and biomedicine and things like that, neuroscience, to try to get that understanding. But yeah, so I kind of started very abstract and dug down into the science, and hopefully my career arcs back up, and one day I can write about these things again. But yeah, in one way I'm still kind of doing that. It's just I felt like I needed I needed other tools and ideas to be able to really understand what I hope to.
Yeah. I think this will probably be our last question. What I read once that when people die, there's like a weight difference. Like immediately when people die, there's like 100 grams or whatever. And people have theorized like that maybe that's the soul leaving the body. Like Descartes was right. Like there's a self, and there's like an ethereal self, or whatever the term he used. But if you were a betting man, what do you think is the difference between like the physical, the cells of a body, and the self? Do you think they're separate? I guess I'm just asking about Descartes and your opinion on his thoughts. But what are your thoughts on the self as it relates to the physical versus, like, I don't know, the spiritual, like the mental?
Wow, that's so I know I've said you've had good questions a lot of times, but that is a perfect question to conclude with because it really summarizes everything. From when I'm wearing my kind of scientist, mitochondrial psychobiology hat, I think the clearest answer that's probably understandable to everyone as the difference between a dead body and a living organism is energy flow.
Mm.
That's really the difference. There's not, at least immediately at the moment of death, there's not major molecular or physiological differences other than those events that correlate with death. But what really happens is that there's no longer energy flow through the organism. So the mitochondria and other glycolysis, these other mechanisms cease, and so cells die because they don't have energy flowing through them. And that's really the case with all of nature, right? Things that are alive have energy flowing through them, and that allows them to act and participate in the world. As for my orientation to religion and spirituality, I don't know, to be honest.
Mm.
And I've had experiences on ayahuasca and ibogaine and things like that have opened me up to the possibility that there may be more than just our current scientific understanding of what's going on in the universe. And I'm open to the possibility that there is a soul or some kind of mediator of that energy flow or something like that. I first did ayahuasca. I was a kind of God delusion thumping atheist. I was reading Dawkins and I was also reading Alan Watts and people like that. So I was curious, but yeah, it was after those experiences that I became more open to the possibility that there was more than our scientific understanding of these things. But yeah, now I kind of I probably moved toward that direction more than 50% after those experiences. But now I kind of sit in a position of I don't want to say uncertainty, but just openness or to whatever the reality may be. I think it's just as fantastic and amazing if it is just energy flow through an organism that animates us, because it's amazing that we can have these sorts of experiences through biological mechanisms, and the experiences you have on ayahuasca are so profound. It's amazing that could be produced by your nervous system. I mean, in certain cases, you'll see more art in 10 minutes during that period that is just so profound than in all of the halls of art museums all over the world. So it's amazing that each of us perhaps have that inner artist and inner, capacity to have these profound experiences. But it's also quite possible that there's something else going on. But it's very difficult to know what that is. And the last thing I wanted to say about this is you mentioned Descartes. So the endogenous DMT idea actually came. The way it's been framed after it was discovered actually came from Descartes. So Descartes believed that the way that the soul interacted with the body was through the pineal gland, and for a long time it was hypothesized by Rick Strassman and one of my mentors, Steve Barker, that the pineal gland may be the site of endogenous DMT production, and it created this whole kind of I don't know what you would call it, like a mythology or a folk understanding or folk wisdom of confirming Descartes' intuitions on this. And it does seem like DMT is produced in the brain, although recent work that came out from Dr. Barker and Jimo Borgesian and John Dean at Michigan suggests that the pineal gland may not actually be the site of DMT synthesis. They were able to find more in the visual cortex, and removing the pineal gland didn't change the amount of DMT that was produced very much. And so yeah, it may or may not be the case that DMT that our body produces mediates kind of spiritual or near-death experiences or things like this. It could very well be the case, but it may not be. And Dave Nichols and Chuck Nichols have written some really great work criticizing this. But it does seem that it's produced, and it does seem that near death or during cardiac arrest, production of DMT is increased. But yeah, it's interesting, and the pineal gland's an interesting organ, but it doesn't seem to come from there. So I think that's kind of illustrative of the fact that we really don't know. Sometimes we have mythologies, or we have ideas about what's going on, or where these experiences come from, or the mechanistic means by which we have experiences and things like that. But biology and really reality seems to always escape our investigations. And I really do think that the mystery, as Brian Marescu says in the Immortality Key, is really the most amazing place you can really stand in relation to spirituality and this very weird thing that's going on with us being here, human beings on this planet, doing podcasts and stuff. So yeah, that's kind of where I am.